Hello again, everyone. So I wanted to take just a short video here to talk about what could be some of the problems with democracy. So we find ourselves born into a society which has indoctrinated us to uh, value democracy. Right? So as we grow up in school, we hear about how great democracy is. Through the news, we hear how great democracy is, and we're just inundated with all this information about how good democracy is. It's supposed to be the best form of government, right? And in many ways, we've learned a lot of valuable information, right? So democracy seems to get something right. It seems to take power out of the hands of tyrannical overlords and fascists and put power in the hands of the people in order for them to decide how they'd like to be ruled, right? So the idea is supposed to be we don't have somebody making decisions for us. We all get to take part in the decisions that will eventually determine how we can live our lives, set up laws that restrict our actions. And so that's supposed to be good. We have a say in what's going on. We have some type of representation. So we get to inject a bit of ourselves, hopefully, into the decisions that are made instead of just being sort of passive bystanders, right? The bystander who's just sort of hoping that the authoritarian dictator um, will make decisions that fall in line with how we feel and what we want. And there's a bunch of other plus sides to democracy too, right? So this video isn't just to sit there and bash on democracy. But one thing we should be doing as responsible intellectuals is questioning our current forms of thinking, right? So we're told democracy is great. We see how it's good because we've been told how it's good. Now let's see if we can actually justify some of those beliefs and then see if we can overcome any of the problems that exist. So for many of you, you might not have heard of many of these issues for democracy before. If you have, that's fine too. Time for a little review. So what are some big problems for democracy? First and foremost, and this has been discussed this has been discussed for a long time, but it was discussed a lot by the founding fathers and James Madison and Alexander Hamilton in the Federalist Papers. There's this problem with democracy of the tyranny of the majority. What does that mean? Well, the tyranny of the majority occurs in a democracy because the majority will always have the overwhelming amount of power, right? So if you live or you exist in a minority culture, and you want your interests represented in the government, it's very unlikely that you'll be able to succeed unless you can somehow convince enough of the people who are in the majority to side with you. And so we've seen how daunting of a task this can be with African Americans in the civil rights movement, with homosexual individuals with the gay rights movement, right? So we've seen how long these battles took. Well, really, all these people were asking for was equality. And you might think, well, if they're only asking for equality, clearly that's a morally good thing. Why did it take so long? Well, it's because they only had a minority. They only had this minority of numbers, right, compared to the majority of the society. So even though their view, I mean, we'll just assume here that equality is a good thing. Hopefully that's not too dramatic for many of you. But insofar as we're assuming that equality is a good thing, why should we have to wait around or even try to convince the majority that we should treat everybody equally? Right? So the tyranny of the majority occurs because the majority can always put that minority view down. Right, so the comic above this video says that 51% of the people voted that tall people no longer have to pay taxes. So the burden falls on the 49% of short people. So it just so happens that the majority consists of tall people, and they're just going to keep voting for that forever, right? Every time the short people bring up an amendment or a change to the law, the 51% tall people will vote it down so that they can keep avoiding taxes. Right? And so the only hope the short people have are, well, one, they could hope that enough tall people die off or enough more short people are born, right? So that the numbers eventually change and the short people can become the majority, or they have to try and convince people who are tall to give up that practice and go for something more fair, right? So so the problem with the tyranny of the majority is it gives too much power to the majority view, whether or not the majority holds the right view, right? And so you can have minority cultures, races, so on and so forth, just perpetually have their interests ignored, right? And that's not good. Democracy is supposed to represent all of our interests, at least somewhat, right? We should be able to have a say in the process. But if you're in one of these minority groups, you might never get a say in the process. So it doesn't seem like it's fair to these people. So that's one big problem, tyranny of the majority. Second, and this is somewhat like what we'll hear from Plato soon and below when we talk about the Republic, it seems to put power in the hands of those who are the least qualified to use it. So think about a number of other fields first here. Think about economics, law, morality, efficiency, all of these different things. So if we're thinking about law, who do we want in charge here, right? Well, we don't want anybody who's just ever thought about the law. So if you've seen Always Sunny in Philadelphia, we don't want Charlie in charge of the law, right? So for those of you who haven't seen, Charlie's an expert in bird law. And that's the only type of law he knows anything about. So if we have a legal question on our hands, we don't want Charlie in charge. And we don't want, I know very little about the law. You don't want me in charge. I'm assuming the same is true of all of you. So why would we give power to those who are least qualified to use it in terms of legal questions? We want those who are most qualified. We want people who actually have studied the law, know the laws at hand, and have reasoned about them for a bit. So I think one great sort of big example of this is when we're trying to determine what type of health care a state should have, right? So when we're talking about healthcare, that's going to include a number of different things, right? We're going to have to talk about the economy. We're going to have to talk about morality. What rights do people have? Is there a right to healthcare? We're going to have to talk about whether or not we can make the proper legal channels available in order to secure whatever type of healthcare we're worried about. And then we also have to worry about the efficiency of our system to see if we can actually get healthcare to the people who need it, right? And so if we just start handing power to any old person off the streets, right? If we just start gathering a random sample of people, put them all in a room, and say, okay, come up with the new system of healthcare for the United States. Right? I'm assuming most of you would be uneasy about that. You'd be uncomfortable. You'd say, well, what do those people know about building a healthcare system? We're going to be doomed this way. They're going to send us into oblivion. They're not going to have any idea how to construct such a complex system. And so Plato thinks a very similar thing is happening with democracy, right? So democracy, especially Athenian democracy, where Plato was from, right, in Athens, it was a direct democracy, not like ours. Ours is a representative democracy. In Athens, they had a direct democracy, so all of the well, it wasn't all inclusive. All of the white males, landowning white males in Athens, got together, and literally every single person had a say in what was going on. Every single person had a vote. Where we have something more representative, but still, that doesn't matter. What's important here about the scenario is that Plato thinks, okay, well, what we're doing is we're just taking everyone. We're saying, come on in, everybody. Whether or not you know anything about democracy, whether or not you know anything about the questions we're about to be asking, now have your say, take a vote, and we'll go by whatever the group votes on. And Plato thinks this is just crazy. Why are we giving power to just any old person? Right? We should have people in power, in the seats of government, who are actually qualified, who know something about justice, who know something about the law, who know something about morality, who know something about wisdom, people who have the proper knowledge for making these really complex decisions about how we organize our lives with one another. So that's another problem for democracy. It seems to put power in the hands of those who are least qualified to use it. We need people who have better qualifications. What are some other issues for democracy? I mean, there's a bunch, right? So we have all the ones you're currently hearing in the news about how democracy, if we don't really constrain funding, can quickly turn into an oligarchy. It can quickly turn into a government that's owned by corporate interests. Right, so maybe those are some worries about democracy too, but you guys probably have already heard about a lot of those. What else? So there's another sort of similar thing to what we'll see in Plato. In times of crisis, we need to protect the nation, right? And Plato thinks this requires a unified front, and that we just can't have this unified front in a democratic government, because in a democracy, there's gonna be different groups who have different views, right? So in our current U.S. democracy, we get to see Republicans, Democrats, and their sort of sub views, right? You can have like libertarians, Tea Party members, constitutional conservatives, and socialists, and liberals, and so on and so forth, right? So the point is, in order to have effective leadership, we need a unified front. And we can't have that with democracy because there's too many people who have opposing views to one another. Okay, so let's think about, now I think that's a good discussion. You probably have a good enough understanding about what's wrong with democracy. In addition, hopefully these added to the things you already know, and hopefully there's more to discover, right? We need to find out what all the issues are so we can solve them. But let's talk about what Plato thought were the major two problems for democracy before we end this video. And one is just that he saw how democracy can lead to unjust action. Right? So from the reading, you know that Socrates was put to death by the Athenian democracy. He was charged with impiety and corrupting the youth, and Plato thinks, and many others at the time thought as well, that this was an unjust court case, right? So Socrates really wasn't guilty of these things, but nevertheless, he was put to death because enough of the Democratic Assembly sided with the opposing party. And so Plato very early on saw that democracy can lead to these unjust situations, and that's bad. He thinks if we have people who are wise and know all about justice and goodness, that something like that would never happen. And then second, and this is similar to what we've already mentioned, he thinks it fails to provide effective leadership. So once again, because democracy will necessarily include a plurality of views, right? We're going to have all these different parties who, even when they're similar to one another, right? So you have all the conservative parties, you have all of the liberal parties, but they all have their sub-disciplines, so on and so forth. There's going to be just too much disagreement, and effective leadership requires some type of agreement, right? Some type of actions we can all get behind. Otherwise, we'll just spend our time bickering amongst each other. And so we'll never make any progress because we'll spend so much time arguing with those who oppose us that we'll never make this progress. Okay, so we've talked generally about what's wrong with democracy, but Plato's two, and this is big to remember, right? One, it led to the death of his mentor. He thought democracy could easily lead to unjust action because all you had to do was convince some people that your cause was just, whether or not it actually is just. And then two, it fails to provide effective leadership. Okay, so next video we'll get into actually discussing what Plato thought should replace democracy. Thank you.